There is a collection of clay tablets in the Mesopotamian Gallery of the British Museum in London. The largest fragment is approximately 15 centimeters tall and 11 centimeters wide. It is broken. Pieces are missing. What survives is written in Akkadian cuneiform, small wedge-shaped impressions pressed into wet clay sometime around the 17th century BCE during the reign of a Babylonian king named Saduqa. The text was not composed in that century. It was copied from something older, something the scribes considered important enough to transcribe again and again across generations. The tablets tell a story that scholars call the Atrahasis epic. The name means exceedingly wise. It is the name given to the one human who was told in advance what was coming and who received, line by line, in imperative language, specific instructions for how to survive it. Those instructions were not prayers, they were not rituals, they were a sequence of physical actions, building specifications, material lists, and timing cues tied to observable events in the sky. And when Zechariah Sitchin, a self-taught scholar of ancient Semitic languages, began publishing his reading of these tablets in 1976, he argued that the instructions were not addressed to one man in one flood. They were a protocol tied to a recurring event. And the tablets, he argued, contain the timing mechanism that tells you when the next one begins. The Atrahasis tablets have been studied since their first major publication in 1969 by W. G. Lambert and A. R. Millard, both Assyriologists, working at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. Lambert and Millard produced a critical edition of the text that remains the scholarly standard more than 5 decades later. The tablets describe in 3 parts the creation of human beings by the Anunnaki, the gods of the Sumerian and Akkadian pantheon, the growing crisis that led the divine assembly to decide on humanity's destruction, and the intervention of the god Enki, who delivered a survival protocol to one chosen human through a reed wall. The physical object is real. The translation is published. The instructions Enki delivers are specific. They include dimensions of a vessel, materials for waterproofing, a command to abandon possessions and preserve life, and a directive to gather the seed of all living things. What Sitchin proposed, and what no peer-reviewed response has specifically refuted, is that those instructions are not literary convention. They are a survival protocol calibrated to a celestial cycle. The cycle, he argued, is encoded in a separate artifact held at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, England. That artifact is the Weld-Blundell prism, a 4-sided clay prism approximately 20 centimeters tall, inscribed on all 4 faces in Sumerian cuneiform. It is also known as the Sumerian King List. It lists 8 kings who ruled before the flood with reign lengths that total 241,200 years. Sitchin's argument is that those numbers are not symbolic. They are orbital counts, and the orbital unit they encode, the SAR, a period of 3,600 years, is the return interval of the body the Sumerians called Nibiru. The Atrahasis instructions in this reading are not a memory of one past event. They are a standing protocol. And the Sumerian King List is the clock that tells you when the protocol needs to be executed again. The Atrahasis tablets are not a single pristine document. They survive as a patchwork of fragments, the main Old Babylonian recension, supplemented by later Assyrian copies. And Lambert and Millard's edition is a reconstruction that stitches together material from multiple sources to produce a continuous narrative. The gaps in the physical record are acknowledged by the translators themselves, but the sections that survive most completely are precisely the sections that matter for Sitchin's argument. The instructions Enki delivers before the catastrophe and the enumeration of what must be done and when. The Weld-Blundell prism, by contrast, is essentially complete. All 4 faces are legible. The antediluvian king list is intact. The numbers are not reconstructed. They are read directly from the clay. Both artifacts are publicly accessible. Both have been translated and published by mainstream scholars using standard methodologies. The question of how their contents relate to each other, whether the instructions in one are calibrated to the numbers in the other, has not been resolved in peer review. And the Mesopotamian tablets are not the only ancient texts that describe cyclical catastrophes with specific survival instructions and celestial timing. The Book of Enoch, the Hopi oral tradition, the Vedic Mahayuga cycle, and the Mayan long count calendar all describe recurring destruction events keyed to astronomical periods, traditions separated by thousands of kilometers and developed by cultures with no known contact. If you find that the academic literature on artifacts like these has been incomplete, if you suspect there are records still sitting in museums waiting for someone to read them differently, this channel is for that work. Subscribe only if that is the question you have been looking for. The rest of us continue. The conventional reading of the Atrahasis epic is well established and broadly consistent across major translations. Lambert and Millard in 1969, Stephanie Dalley in her 2000 edition of Myths from Mesopotamia, and Benjamin Foster in his Before the Muses anthology all treat the text as a mythological narrative in the Mesopotamian literary tradition. The standard interpretation holds that the Atrahasis epic is a cosmogonic text, a story that explains why humans exist, why the gods are sometimes angry, and why floods happen, the creation sequence in which the Anunnaki mix divine blood with clay to produce a worker species is read as theological metaphor for the relationship between humans and the divine. The flood itself is read as a literary device shared across ancient Near Eastern cultures. An archetype that also appears in the Gilgamesh Epic's Tablet 11 and in chapters 6 through 9 of Genesis. The instructions Enki delivers to Atrahasis are understood as genre conventions of the flood hero story: the divine warning, the impossible deadline, the faithful builder. Every element has a function within the narrative rather than as a freestanding document. The enormous reign lengths in the Sumerian King List, individual kings ruling for tens of thousands of years, are treated by mainstream Assyriology as honorific or symbolic. Samuel Noah Kramer, the Sumerologist who spent decades at the University of Pennsylvania translating Sumerian literary texts, wrote that the antediluvian King List likely reflects a mythological preamble added to legitimize historical dynasties that followed the flood narrative. The numbers in this reading are not measurements, they are assertions of antiquity, a way of saying these kings ruled in a time so remote it belongs to the age of the gods. Leo Oppenheim, the Assyriologist whose 1964 work Ancient Mesopotamia remains a standard reference, treated the antediluvian section of the King List similarly, as a literary and theological construct rather than a historical record. The reign lengths in his framework reflect scribal conventions about deep time rather than chronological data. This is the consensus. It has been stable since the middle of the 20th century. It is held by scholars whose work is rigorous, whose translations are careful, and whose contributions to the understanding of Mesopotamian civilization are foundational. The conventional reading also provides a context for the Atrahasis instructions themselves. The commands Enki deliver to build a vessel, seal it with bitumen, gather living things aboard, are compared to similar flood instructions in other ancient Near Eastern texts. The Gilgamesh Epic's Tablet 11, in which Utnapishtim receives nearly identical instructions from Ea, is treated as a parallel literary tradition drawing on the same source material. The Genesis flood narrative, in which God instructs Noah to build an ark with specific dimensions and pitch it inside and out, is seen as a Hebrew adaptation of the Mesopotamian original. In all three cases, mainstream scholarship reads the instructions as narrative elements that serve a storytelling function. They create urgency, demonstrate the protagonist's obedience, and establish the practical details that make the myth feel concrete. The specificity of the instructions is, in this reading, a mark of literary craft rather than engineering documentation. The dimensions are symbolic rather than functional. The timing cues are dramatic rather than astronomical. This is a coherent interpretation. It accounts for the surface features of the text, and for the most part, it was arrived at without addressing the specific mathematical properties of the numbers in the king list, without asking why all 8 antediluvian reign lengths, and only those 8, share a single divisor. In 1976, Zecharia Sitchin published The 12th Planet, the first volume in what would become a 12-book series called The Earth Chronicles. Sitchin was not an Assyriologist by academic training. He was born in Baku, Azerbaijan in 1920, raised in Palestine, and educated in London, where he studied economics and history at the London School of Economics. He taught himself to read cuneiform, Sumerian, Akkadian, and Old Babylonian, and spent decades working through tablets in the reading rooms of the British Museum. His professional career was in journalism and shipping, but his research interest was singular: the Sumerian textual corpus and what it actually says when read without the assumption that its contents are mythological. His reading of the Atrahasis epic and the Sumerian King List rests on a single interpretive move that separates his framework from the conventional one. He argued that the Sumerian word sar, which in standard lexicons denotes 3,600, is not an arbitrary large number used for literary effect. It is an orbital period. Specifically, it is the orbital period of the body the Sumerians called Nibiru, a large planet on an elongated elliptical orbit that passes through the inner solar system once every 3,600 years. If the SAR is an orbital period, then the antediluvian reign links in the king list are not symbolic. They are counts of how many orbital passages each king administered through. The arithmetic is straightforward and verifiable. The 8 kings who ruled before the flood reigned for a total of 67 SARs. 67 times 3,600 equals 241,200, the number the king list actually gives. Every antediluvian reign length in the Weld-Blundell prism is divisible by 3,600. There are no remainders. Alalim of Eridu reigned for 8 SARs, 28,800 years. Alalgar reigned for 10 SARs, 36,000 years. Enmenluana of Bad Tibira reigned for 12 SARs, 43,200 years. Enmengalana reigned for 8 SARs, 28,800 years. Dumuzi, the shepherd of Bad Tibira, reigned for 10 SARs, 36,000 years. Ensipadzid Ana of Larak reigned for 8 SARs, 28,800 years. Enmendur Ana of Sippur reigned for 5 SARs and 5 Nirs, a Nir being 600, for a total of 21,000 years. And Ubra Tutu of Shurapak reigned for 5 SARs and 1 Ener, 18,600 years. Sitchin did not invent these numbers. The numbers are on the prism, which was translated by Stephen Langdon at Oxford in 1923 and has been on public display at the Ashmolean since. What Sitchin did was propose a physical interpretation for why those specific numbers, and no others, appear in the antediluvian section. That interpretation is the orbital period of Nibiru. No peer-reviewed publication has demonstrated that the perfect divisibility by 3,600 is coincidental, or that a more compelling mathematical explanation exists for the pattern. The academic response to Sitchin's observation has been, for the most part, dismissal without engagement. A pattern this script will examine in detail. The methodology Sitchin used is not complex. It does not require specialized training to reproduce. You take the antediluvian reign lengths as recorded on the Weld-Blundell prism, the same numbers that Langdon translated, that Kramer cited, that every Assyriological reference work reproduces. You divide each reign length by 3,600. If the numbers are arbitrary or symbolic, you would expect the results to be messy, irrational, non-integer, scattered across the number line. If the numbers encode a whole number multiple of a base unit, you would expect the results to be clean integers. The results are clean integers. Every single one. 8 kings, 8 divisions, 8 whole numbers with 0 remainders. The probability of this occurring by chance, assuming the reign lengths were selected from a random distribution of large numbers, is extremely low. This is not a matter of interpretation, it is arithmetic. The numbers are published, the division can be performed by anyone with a calculator, and the result is either meaningful, suggesting the SAR is a base unit that governs these specific values, or coincidental in a way that has not been quantified or addressed in the academic literature. Sitchin also identified a secondary feature that has received less attention. The five antediluvian cities listed in the King List, Eridu, Bad Tibera, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak, are assigned their kings in a specific sequence, with kingship transferring from one city to the next. The total duration of kingship in each city, when expressed in SARs, produces clean values as well. Eridu's two kings ruled for a combined 18 SARs. Bad Tibera's three kings ruled for a combined 30 SARs. Larak's single king ruled for 8 SARs. Sippar's single king for 5 SARs and 5 Nairs, and Shurupak's single king for 5 SARs and 1 Nair. The distribution is not uniform, but it is structured, and the structure appears intentional rather than arbitrary. In 2007, more than 3 decades after the 12th planet, Sitchin published The End of Days, in which he extended the framework to its logical conclusion. If the SAR is an orbital period and the tablets record previous orbital passages, then the texts contain enough data to calculate when the next passage occurs. The Atrahasis instructions in this reading are not a record of one past event. They are a standing protocol, instructions that become relevant each time the orbital clock completes a cycle. The Sumerian King List is the mechanism that tracks where in the cycle the present falls. Sitchin argued that by correlating the antediluvian rain data with known astronomical anchor points, a return window could be estimated. The calculation rests on identifying anchor points, known dates that the texts associate with specific orbital passages, and then counting forward in increments of 3,600 years. If the last confirmed passage occurred at a date that can be established or estimated from the textual record, then adding 3,600 years produces the estimated date of the next passage. Sitchin's methodology for establishing those anchor points drew on his readings of multiple cuneiform sources and his interpretations of historical events described in the texts. His conclusions are published. His reasoning is laid out. The chain of inference is available for anyone to examine, challenge, or refute. You do not have to accept Sitchin's specific anchor dates to recognize the structural logic of the argument. If the SAR is real, the texts provide enough data to calculate a return window. The precision of that window depends on the precision of the anchor dates, which are themselves contested, but the framework, the idea that the King List embeds a calculable cycle, is either mathematically sound or it is not, and no published analysis has demonstrated that it is not. What has not happened in the years since 2007 is the publication of a peer-reviewed response that engages with the specific calculation on its own mathematical terms. What follows from Sitchin's reading, if even its basic structural claim is correct, is a reframing of the entire Atrahasis text, not as literature, but as operational documentation. The instructions Enki delivers through the reed wall are not poetry. They are not literary ornament. They are imperative commands with physical specifications. The text says, and Lambert and Millard's own translation confirms this, that Enki told Atrahasis to destroy his house and build a vessel. The dimensions are given. The material is specified, bitumen for waterproofing inside and out. The cargo manifest is explicit, the seed of all living things, family members and craftsmen with specific skills. The timing is tied to observable phenomena. When specific signs appear, the event is imminent. In the conventional reading, these details are treated as narrative texture, the kind of concrete imagery that makes a myth feel vivid. In Sitchin's reading, they are engineering parameters. The vessel is not a metaphor. The bitumen is not symbolic. The cargo list is not literary convention. They are the contents of a protocol designed to be executed. The distinction matters because the Atrahasis text is not the only Mesopotamian source that delivers instructions in this imperative register. The Sumerian concept of the ME, divine decrees that govern civilization, includes specific protocols for agriculture, metallurgy, record keeping, weaving, jurisprudence, and what the texts call the descent and the ascent. The ME were not abstract principles. They were, in the Sumerian textual tradition, objects, physical tablets, or containers that could be carried, stolen, and transferred between cities. The myth of Inanna and Enki, one of the best preserved Sumerian literary compositions, describes Inanna physically transporting the ME from Eridu to Uruk in a boat, a journey that Enki attempts to reverse by sending sea monsters to intercept her. The ME are counted. The myth names over 100 individual ME, each corresponding to a specific domain of knowledge or institutional function. If the ME represent codified knowledge, operational protocols preserved in physical form, and if the Atrahasis instructions are one instance of that knowledge applied to a specific recurring scenario, then the tablets are not recounting a myth. They are preserving a procedure. And the procedure has a trigger condition, the return of a celestial body on a calculable orbit. Consider the specific language of the Atrahasis instructions as Lambert and Millard translated them. The text does not say, "Pray to the gods, and perhaps you will be saved." It says, "Destroy the house, build a boat." These dimensions, this material, seal it with bitumen, shall inside and out. Load it with the seed of all living things. Watch for specific phenomena that indicate the event is imminent. These are not the instructions of a poet. They are the instructions of someone who has done this before, or who has access to a record written by someone who has. The imperative register, the direct, unqualified command structure, is consistent across the surviving fragments. There is no hedging. There is no ambiguity about what must be done. The instructions assume that the recipient will execute them literally, physically, without metaphorical interpretation. And the timing is not left to divine whim. It is keyed to observable events, phenomena in the sky and on the earth that serve as countdown markers. The conventional reading accounts for this imperative tone by noting that divine commands in Mesopotamian literature are always framed as absolute directives. The gods speak in imperatives because they are gods. But this explanation, while valid within its literary framework, does not account for the physical specificity. Many Mesopotamian texts contain divine commands to build temples, to wage wars, to perform rituals. Those commands are typically framed in general terms. Build a temple worthy of the god. Go forth and conquer. Perform the sacred rite at the appointed time. The Atrahasis instructions are different. They specify materials. They specify construction technique. They specify cargo categories. They provide observable timing indicators. The level of technical detail in the Atrahasis instructions is anomalous within the corpus of Mesopotamian divine command literature. It reads less like a mythological speech and more like a field manual. The geographic specificity of the text supports this reading. The antediluvian cities named in the Sumerian King List, Eridu, Bad Tibera, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak, are not mythological places. They are real archaeological sites in southern Iraq, distributed along the ancient courses of the Euphrates. Eridu, which the King List names as the first city where kingship descended from heaven, has been excavated extensively. The site, known today as Tel Abu Shahrin, lies approximately 22 kilometers southwest of the modern city of Nasiriyah. Excavations conducted by Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd for the Iraqi Directorate of Antiquities in the 1940s and 1950s revealed a sequence of temple structures dating back to approximately 5,400 BCE, among the oldest monumental architecture in the world. Shuruppak, where the King List places the last antediluvian king before the flood, has been identified with the modern site of Tel Farah. Excavations there, first by Robert Koldewey's German team in the late 19th century and later by Erich Schmidt of the University of Pennsylvania in the 1930s, revealed a distinct flood deposit in the stratigraphy, a layer of water-laid sediment that has been radiocarbon dated to approximately 2900 BCE. The texts do not describe imaginary places. They describe a specific geography, and within that geography, they describe a sequence of administrative centers that the King List presents as stations in a timeline that culminates in a flood. The flood layer at Shuruppak is real. It is not unique. Similar flood deposits have been found at Ur, excavated by Leonard Woolley in the 1920s, and at Kish, excavated by Langdon himself. Woolley famously interpreted the flood layer at Ur, approximately 3 meters of clean, water-deposited clay separating earlier and later occupation levels, as evidence of the biblical flood. Later scholarship scaled back this claim, noting that flood deposits at different Mesopotamian sites date to different periods and likely represent separate local flood events rather than a single universal deluge. This correction is fair, but it does not eliminate the fact that the sites named in the Sumerian King List as antediluvian cities show physical evidence of catastrophic flooding in their archaeological records. The texts name specific cities. Those cities exist. Those cities have flood layers. The correlation between the textual record and the physical evidence does not prove the Atrahasis narrative is literal, but it establishes that the narrative is anchored in a real geography, where real floods occurred. The stratigraphy is published. The excavation reports are available. If you want to check any of this, the primary sources exist in university libraries and in the archives of the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. The Book of Enoch provides the first cross-cultural parallel that intersects directly with the Atrahasis framework. Specifically, the section known as the Book of the Watchers, comprising the first 36 chapters of the Ethiopian text, describes a group of beings who descended to Earth, established a presence among humans, and were eventually removed. The Book of Enoch is canonical in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church and exists in a complete Ge'ez manuscript tradition dating to the 15th century CE, though Aramaic fragments recovered from the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran have been dated to the 3rd century BCE. The Watchers are described as beings who taught humans forbidden technologies, metallurgy, cosmetics, astrology, weapons manufacturing, and whose departure is described not as a permanent exit, but as a removal pending judgment. First, Enoch chapter 16 describes the spirits of the giants, the offspring of the Watchers and human women, as bound until a specific appointed time, after which their sentence concludes. The text does not say the Watchers are gone forever. It says they are gone for now. The parallel to the Atrahasis is structural. In both texts, non-human beings establish a relationship with humanity. A crisis occurs. A selected human receives advance warning with specific instructions for survival. And in both cases, the texts indicate that the cycle is not finished, that what happened before can happen again. The Book of Enoch adds an element the Atrahasis tablets leave implied, a calendrical framework. The Astronomical Book of Enoch, chapters 72 through 82, describes a solar calendar of 364 days divided into 4 seasons of 91 days each, with intercalary adjustments that maintain alignment with solar observations. Scholars including James Vanderkam of the University of Notre Dame have argued that this calendar reflects genuine observational astronomy, not mythological fancy. If two independent textual traditions, one Mesopotamian, one rooted in Second Temple Judaism, both describe non-human intelligences who arrived, intervened, departed, and are expected to return, and both embed their narratives in specific calendrical and astronomical frameworks, the question of coincidence becomes difficult to sustain. The conventional explanation for the narrative parallels is literary borrowing. The Israelites absorbed Mesopotamian flood traditions during the Babylonian exile of the 6th century BCE and reworked them into their own theological framework. That explanation accounts for the broad narrative elements, the flood, the chosen survivor, the divine warning. What it does not account for is the calendrical precision. The Enochic calendar is not a copy of the Mesopotamian calendar. It uses a solar structure of 364 days rather than the lunisolar system the Babylonians employed. Its intercalary logic is different. Its mathematical foundation is different. If the parallel is borrowing, the calendar should match. It does not. What matches is the function. Both traditions encode precise time reckoning systems alongside narratives of departure and return. Both traditions treat the calendar not as a convenience, but as a survival critical tool, something that must be maintained because the timing of future events depends on it. If you want to check Vanderkam's analysis, his work on the Anunnaki calendar is published by Brill, an academic press based in Leiden. The argument is available to anyone who wants to evaluate it. The academic response to Sitchin's work has followed a pattern that is by now familiar to anyone who studies the boundary between alternative and mainstream archaeology. The pattern is not refutation, it is dismissal by characterization. Sitchin's books have sold millions of copies in dozens of languages since 1976. They cite specific tablets, specific museum collections, specific lines of cuneiform text. The scholarly response, with very few exceptions, has consisted of the following: reviews that characterize Sitchin as a pseudo scholar without addressing his specific numerical claims, encyclopedic entries that categorize his work under pseudo archaeology without publishing a counter calculation, and documentary treatments that present the Sumerian King List without mentioning that every antediluvian reign length is divisible by 3,600. The asymmetry is worth stating plainly. Sitchin published a specific mathematical observation about a specific artifact that sits in a specific museum. The observation is verifiable by anyone with access to the Weld-Blundell prism's published numbers, and those numbers have been published since 1923. The appropriate academic response to a specific mathematical claim is a specific mathematical counterargument, either demonstrating that the divisibility is coincidental and statistically unremarkable, or providing an alternative explanation for the pattern that is more parsimonious than the one Sitchin offered. That counterargument has not been published. What has been published is characterization. Sitchin has been called a fantasist, a pseudo-linguist, a crank. His reading of specific Sumerian terms, particularly his translation of the word Nibiru and his interpretation of the term Anunnaki, has been contested on linguistic grounds, and in some cases, those linguistic criticisms are substantive. This script will address the strongest of them, but the numerical claim about the king list has not been refuted. It has been ignored, and the distinction between refutation and dismissal is not trivial. It is, in fact, the central distinction on which the integrity of academic discourse depends. Refutation requires engaging with specific claims on their terms. It requires showing the data, running the numbers, publishing the result in a venue where it can itself be scrutinized. Dismissal requires only a label. You attach the label pseudo-archaeology to a body of work, and the work is effectively excluded from serious consideration. No counter-calculation is necessary. No mathematical engagement is required. The label does the work that the argument should have done, and the label has been applied to Sitchin's work generously. The engagement has not. This pattern is not unique to Sitchin. It recurs with regularity at the boundary between mainstream and alternative research in the historical sciences. Robert Schoch, a geologist holding a doctorate from Yale University and a faculty position at Boston University, published evidence in the early 1990s that the weathering patterns on the Great Sphinx at Giza are consistent with water erosion from sustained rainfall, a climatological condition that predates the conventional construction date of approximately 2500 BCE by thousands of years. Schoch's geological analysis was presented at the Geological Society of America's annual meeting. The geological community did not, for the most part, engage with the specifics of his weathering data. The Egyptological community responded with characterization. Schoch was not an Egyptologist. His hypothesis was sensationalist, and it contradicted the established chronology. The weathering data itself was not addressed by a published geological counterstudy. The characterization was treated as sufficient. The Sphinx weathering data has been available for more than 3 decades. It has not been refuted by a geological counterstudy. It has been managed by social and institutional pressure, the unspoken understanding that pursuing Schoch's line of inquiry would be professionally disadvantageous for a young geologist seeking tenure. The data has not gone away. It sits in the same category as Sitchin's King List observation, a specific testable claim that has been characterized rather than tested. Avi Loeb, the Frank B. Baird Jr., professor of science at Harvard University and former chair of the Harvard Astronomy Department, published a peer-reviewed paper in the Astrophysical Journal Letters in 2018 arguing that the interstellar object designated Oumuamua exhibited anomalous acceleration consistent with radiation pressure on a thin, flat surface, characteristics that, he argued, were consistent with a light sail of artificial origin. The astronomical community responded in part with legitimate scientific engagement. Alternative hypotheses involving hydrogen outgassing and other natural explanations were proposed and published, but the response also included public statements characterizing Loeb as irresponsible for entertaining the possibility of an artificial origin and suggestions that his willingness to discuss the hypothesis publicly was damaging to the credibility of the field. Loeb documented this response in his 2021 book Extraterrestrial, published by Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. His observation about the nature of the academic response was precise. The objection was not that his calculations were wrong, but that his conclusion was socially unacceptable. The form of the response reveals more than its content. When the response to a specific testable claim is not a test but a characterization, when the rebuttal is not a calculation but a label, the question the claim raises remains open. It does not matter how many times the label is applied. Labels do not close questions. Data closes questions. Counter calculations close questions. Published refutations close questions. Consider what a genuine refutation of Sitchin's King List observation would look like. It would require one of the following: a demonstration that the divisibility of the antediluvian rain, lengths by 3,600, is statistically unremarkable given the constraints of the sexagesimal number system. A probability analysis showing that any set of 8 numbers drawn from the likely range would produce clean division at a sufficiently high rate to render the observation trivial, or alternatively, a demonstration that the specific rain lengths are derived from a known scribal convention or literary formula that generates multiples of 3,600 as a byproduct without the numbers carrying any chronological or astronomical content. Either demonstration would constitute a refutation. Neither has been published. The silence is not evidence that Sitchin is right. Silence is not evidence of anything except the absence of engagement. But when the absence of engagement is the only response to a specific, verifiable arithmetic observation about a physical artifact in a public museum, the observation status as an open question is not a matter of opinion. It is a matter of record. Sitchin's question about the King List numbers remains open. Refutation requires engaging with specific claims. That engagement has not occurred. The Weld-Blundell prism sits in a climate-controlled case at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, where it has been since Stephen Langdon published his translation in 1923. It is inscribed on all 4 faces in Sumerian cuneiform, and the text begins with one of the most consequential opening lines in the history of ancient literature. Kingship descended from heaven. The first city to receive kingship was Eridu. The first king was Alalim. And then, reign by reign, city by city, the prism tracks a sequence of rulers through the antediluvian period, through the flood, and into the historical dynasties that archaeologists can cross-reference with other records. The antediluvian section, the 8 kings before the flood, occupies a small portion of the total text, but it is the portion that has generated the most interpretive controversy. The reason is the numbers. In the Sumerian sexagesimal system, base 60, which the Mesopotamians invented and which the modern world still uses for minutes, seconds, and degrees of arc, the number 3,600 occupies a structurally significant position. It is 60 times 60. It is the square of the base. In our decimal system, the equivalent position is occupied by the number 100, 10 times 10. The Sumerians gave this number a specific name, the Sar. In conventional Assyriology, the Sar is noted as a mathematical feature of the base 60 system, and its significance is treated as numerical rather than physical. Sitchin argued that the significance is not merely numerical. He argued that 3,600 years is a specific physical duration, the time it takes for a body on an elongated elliptical orbit to complete one circuit from the outer solar system through the inner solar system and back again. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, also held in the British Museum, describes the celestial body called Nibiru as following a path that crosses the orbits of the other planets. Tablet 5 of the Enuma Elish assigns Nibiru a station in the heavens and describes its passage in terms that Sitchin read as describing orbital mechanics rather than mythological symbolism. The conventional reading treats Nibiru as a reference to Jupiter or to a general celestial concept, a crossing point in the sky, rather than a specific undiscovered body. But the Enuma Elish does not describe Jupiter's behavior. Jupiter does not come and go. Jupiter does not approach and then recede to an unseen distance. The Enuma Elish describes a body with a path that intersects the known planetary orbits and then withdraws beyond the region of observation. The text is available in Stephanie Dalley's Myths from Mesopotamia, published by Oxford University Press in 2000. The relevant passages are in tablets 4 and 5. They are available to anyone who wants to read them. What makes the Enuma Elish's description of Nibiru significant for Sitchin's argument is not just that the text describes a celestial body, but that it describes a celestial body with behavioral properties that do not match any of the 5 visible planets the Babylonians observed routinely: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. The Babylonians tracked all 5 with extraordinary precision. Their period tables for these planets survive on tablets and have been verified against modern astronomical calculations. These 5 planets were well known, well characterized, and given specific names in the Babylonian astronomical tradition. Nibiru, as described in the Enuma Elish, is not one of them. It is described as having a distinct orbital characteristic. It arrives, crosses, and departs. The verb used in the Akkadian text is neberu, from the root meaning to cross or to ford. The conventional reading assigns this crossing function to Jupiter, which does cross the meridian of the sky, but Jupiter does not arrive and depart in the way the Enuma Elish describes. Jupiter is always visible in the night sky, moving through its 12-year cycle at a pace that ancient observers could track from night to night. The Enuma Elish describes something that is not always visible, something that appears, crosses the field of the known planets, and then withdraws. The behavioral description fits a long period body on an elliptical orbit far better than it fits any known planet in the Babylonian catalog. This does not prove the existence of such a body, but it establishes that the textual description is anomalous. It does not match what the Babylonians knew about the planets they observed, and it has not been satisfactorily explained by assigning the label to Jupiter. The scribes of ancient Mesopotamia did not write for entertainment. This is not a controversial claim. The cuneiform tradition was, above all else, a record-keeping technology. The earliest tablets from Uruk, dating to approximately 3400 BCE, are administrative documents, grain inventories, labor allocations, livestock counts, land measurements. Writing in Mesopotamia was invented not for poetry, but for accounting. The literary tradition that produced the Atrahasis epic and the Enuma Elish emerged from this accounting culture, and the tablets were stored in archives and libraries that functioned as institutional memory, repositories of knowledge that the state considered essential to preserve across generations. The most famous of these repositories, the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, was assembled in the 7th century BCE by the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, who sent scribes across Mesopotamia with explicit instructions to copy and collect every text of importance. The library held an estimated 30,000 tablets. It was excavated in the 1850s by Henry Laird, a British archaeologist working under the auspices of the British Museum, and subsequently by Hormuzd Rassam, an Assyrian-born archaeologist who discovered many of the key literary texts, including the flood tablet from the Gilgamesh epic. Ashurbanipal's orders to his scribes survive on leaders that have themselves been excavated and translated. In these letters, Ashurbanipal instructs his agents to seek out specific categories of text: astronomical tablets, medical tablets, omen series, creation narratives, king lists, and to copy them faithfully, without omission. The king did not collect these texts as trophies, he collected them as operational knowledge. Ashurbanipal was, by the standards of ancient kings, unusually literate. The texts describe him as one of the few Assyrian rulers who could personally read cuneiform, a skill he was proud of and that his scribes recorded in his royal inscriptions. He understood the value of the tablets not as objects, but as carriers of information that the state needed to function and to anticipate. The astronomical omen series, in particular, were treated as state security documents. They were used to predict events that could affect the king and the empire, and access to them was restricted. The significance of this scribal culture is not the library itself, but the institutional decision making it represents. These texts were copied and recopied across centuries, sometimes across millennia, because the institutions that maintained them considered the information too important to lose. The Atrahasis epic exists in multiple recensions. There is an Old Babylonian version from approximately the 17th century BCE. There is a Middle Babylonian version from several centuries later. And there is a late Assyrian version from Ashurbanipal's library in the 7th century BCE. Three different scribal institutions, separated by 1,000 years, independently chose to copy this particular text. The question is what kind of institutional weight it carried. If the text is mythology, a culturally important story about the gods and the flood, the copying practice reflects religious piety or literary prestige. If the text is protocol, a set of instructions keyed to a specific recurring scenario, the copying practice reflects something closer to operational maintenance. You copy the instructions not because they are beautiful, but because they might be needed again. The astronomical knowledge embedded in Mesopotamian civilization is not in dispute among scholars of the ancient Near East. The Emueld Apine tablets, a compendium of Babylonian astronomical observations compiled around the 7th century BCE, but reflecting observational data from centuries earlier, contain star catalogs, planetary period measurements, and intercalary calculation methods that modern astronomers have verified as observationally accurate to within narrow margins of error. The Babylonians tracked the synodic periods of all 5 visible planets: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. They predicted lunar eclipses with documented accuracy. They developed the zodiacal system that Greek astronomy later adopted and that astrology still uses. They recorded the heliacal risings of stars with precision sufficient to reconstruct the orientation of the night sky over their cities at specific dates. This is not alternative scholarship. This is mainstream history of science, published in journals like the Journal for the History of Astronomy and referenced in standard works like Otto Neugebauer's The Exact Sciences in Antiquity and Bardell von der Verden's Science Awakening. The precision of this astronomical tradition deserves emphasis because it bears directly on the plausibility of the King List numbers as data rather than myth. The Babylonians calculated the synodic period of Venus, the time between successive appearances of Venus as an evening star, to within a few minutes of the modern value. They tracked the retrograde motions of Mars and Jupiter with sufficient accuracy to predict those motions years in advance. They developed algebraic methods for computing planetary positions that were not matched in Europe until the late Renaissance. This was not casual stargazing. It was systematic, institutional, multi-generational scientific observation conducted by trained specialists, priests and scribes whose full-time occupation was watching the sky and recording what they saw. The observation records were kept on tablets and maintained in temple archives across centuries. New observations were compared against old ones. Discrepancies were noted and corrections were applied. The civilization that produced the Atrahasis epic and the Sumerian King List was the same civilization that produced the most sophisticated pre-telescopic astronomical tradition in the ancient world. This fact creates a tension that conventional scholarship has acknowledged but not fully resolved. When a culture is obsessed with precise astronomical measurement, when it tracks planetary periods across centuries, when it develops mathematical tools sophisticated enough to predict eclipses, when it invents the base 60 system that still governs our measurement of time and angle. And that same culture records specific numbers in its most important historical document. The assumption that those numbers are purely symbolic requires an explanation. Why would a civilization that measured everything else with precision suddenly abandon precision in its king list? The question has been posed. It has not been answered. The base 60 system itself is relevant here. The Sumerians did not use base 60 by accident. The system was chosen or inherited because of its extraordinary divisibility. 60 can be evenly divided by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. No smaller number has as many factors. This makes base 60 toch ideal for astronomical calculation, trade measurement, and angular division, all domains where the ability to subdivide cleanly matters. The SAR, 60 times 60, inherits this divisibility. It is the second power of the base, and the antediluvian rain lengths are multiples of this second power. The numbers are not random large values selected to impress. They are structurally embedded in the mathematical system that the Sumerians used for their most precise work. If the numbers are symbolic, they are symbolic in a way that happens to align perfectly with the mathematical structure the Sumerians used for real measurement. If the numbers are data, they are data encoded in the measurement system the Sumerians trusted most. The Tablet of Destiny, a concept that recurs across Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian texts, deserves specific attention in this context. In the Enuma Elish, the Tablet of Destinies is described as an object of supreme power. Whoever possesses it controls the fates, the outcomes of events, the order of the cosmos, the assignments of the gods. In the myth of Anzu, a storm bird or divine creature steals the Tablet of Destinies from Enlil's chamber, and the god Ninurta must recover it in a battle that occupies the entire narrative. In the myth of Inanna's descent to the underworld, the ME, which some scholars consider identical to or derived from the concept of the Tablet of Destinies, are central to the power structure of the divine assembly. The conventional reading treats the Tablet of Destinies as a mythological symbol of divine authority, a narrative device that represents the power of the gods to determine the course of events. But the text described the Tablet of Destinies with remarkable physical specificity. It is an object, it can be held in the hand, it can be stolen, it can be transferred from one possessor to another. It contains information, not emotional content, not symbolic meaning, but information that determines outcomes. If the Sumerian textual tradition is preserving a record of codified knowledge, if the ME are operational protocols and the King List is a data table, then the Tablet of Destinies may represent what a modern systems engineer would call a master reference document, the index that tells you which protocol to execute under which conditions and at what time. The Atrahasis instructions would be one entry in that index, the survival protocol for a specific category of event, keyed to a specific orbital period. This interpretation is speculative. It must be acknowledged as such, but it is speculation anchored in named artifacts that exist in named museums, described in texts that have been translated and published by mainstream scholars, and it is consistent with the textual evidence that those scholars have made available. The speculation follows from the evidence. It does not precede it. The Sumerians had a concept they expressed with the phrase namdubzar, which translates most directly as the scribal art or the craft of the tablet writer. But the role of the scribe in Sumerian institutional culture was not creative. It was custodial. The scribe's fundamental obligation was fidelity, to reproduce the text exactly as received, to preserve the information across time without alteration or embellishment. The colophons found on many Sumerian and Babylonian tablets, short notes at the end of the text, frequently include statements certifying that the copy matches the original, sometimes with the name of the scribe and the date of copying. This practice is the ancient equivalent of version control. The information on the tablet was considered more important than the tablet itself. Clay breaks. Information, if copied faithfully, persists. If the Atrahasis instructions constitute a protocol, then the scribal tradition of faithful copying takes on a specific functional meaning. The instructions had to survive intact across the centuries between orbital passages, because when the next passage occurred, the instructions would need to be available. This reading is consistent with the textual evidence. It is consistent with the scribal practice, and it is consistent with the institutional culture that Oppenheim described in ancient Mesopotamia, a culture in which knowledge was not freely circulated, but carefully maintained, controlled, and transmitted through authorized channels. Oppenheim observed that Mesopotamian scribal schools operated as closed institutions. Access was restricted, curriculum was standardized, and the texts that students copied were selected by the institution, not by the individual. The education of a scribe took approximately 12 years. The skills were hereditary. Scribal families passed the profession from father to son across generations. This is not the profile of a literary culture. It is the profile of a knowledge maintenance infrastructure, and the Atrahasis epic was one of the texts that this infrastructure chose to maintain. There is one more detail worth noting about the physical artifacts. The Atrahasis tablets from the Old Babylonian period include colophon information, scribal notes appended to the text, that identify the scribe who copied them. The main Old Babylonian recension was copied by a scribe named Ku-aya during the reign of Ammi-Saduqa, the fourth king after Hammurabi. Ku-aya's colophon does not describe the Atrahasis text as a story or a poem. It describes it with the standard scribal terminology for a document that has been faithfully transmitted, language that implies the scribe understood the text as an authoritative record rather than a creative composition. This does not prove the text is a protocol. Scribal colophons use standardized formulas that were applied broadly, but it is consistent with the interpretation. And when combined with the imperative register of the instructions, the physical specificity of the commands, the mathematical regularity of the King List numbers, and the cross-cultural parallels that share the same structural features, the convergence of evidence begins to create a pattern that the conventional reading does not fully address. The Hopi tradition of the American Southwest provides a parallel that cannot be explained by literary diffusion from the ancient Near East. The Hopi had no contact with Mesopotamia. They had no access to cuneiform tablets. Their oral tradition developed independently in a geographic and cultural context separated from Sumer by more than 15,000 kilometers and by entirely distinct linguistic and ethnic lineages. And yet the structural parallels are specific enough to resist dismissal as coincidence. The Hopi describe a series of worlds: the first world, the second world, the third world, and the current fourth world, each of which ended in a catastrophe that required the survivors to follow specific instructions in order to transition safely to the next cycle. The instructions in the Hopi oral tradition are not vague spiritual guidance. They are practical and specific: where to go, what to carry, which direction to travel, and which signs in the sky to watch for as indicators of the transition's onset. The Hopi prophecy of the blue star Kachana describes a celestial object, blue, star-like, that appears in the sky and signals the beginning of a period of purification, marking the transition from the fourth world to the fifth. The prophecy specifies that this is not the first time the cycle has occurred. Each previous world ended the same way. Each transition was preceded by specific signs and accompanied by specific instructions for the righteous. The structural parallel to the Atrahasis framework is difficult to overstate. A cyclical catastrophe, advance warning delivered to a selected group, specific survival instructions tied to observable celestial phenomena, and a timing mechanism embedded in the tradition itself that connects the current cycle to previous ones. The Hopi do not frame this as mythology. They frame it as history, a record of events that happened to their ancestors and that will happen again. The elders who preserve these traditions do not speak of them as stories. They speak of them as instructions. The parallel is not merely thematic, it is functional. Both the Atrahasis and the Hopi traditions serve the same purpose: to preserve across generations a set of survival protocols keyed to a recurring celestial event. The Yoruba Ifa divination corpus of West Africa contains a related structural element. The Ifa corpus, one of the most extensive oral knowledge systems in the world, comprising 256 chapters or odu, each containing hundreds of verses, includes passages describing cycles of destruction and renewal administered by the Orisha, the divine powers. The corpus describes specific conditions under which previous ages ended and specific actions that were taken by those who survived to carry knowledge forward into the next cycle. The Ifa system is maintained by trained diviners called Babalawo, whose education takes decades and whose role is explicitly custodial. They preserve the corpus. They do not invent it. The structural parallel to the Mesopotamian scribal tradition is striking. A closed institution of trained specialists maintaining a body of knowledge across generations with an emphasis on fidelity to the original rather than creative elaboration. The content includes cyclical destruction, survival instructions, and celestial timing. The Popol Vuh of the Quiche Maya describes a similar architecture. The gods create humanity multiple times. Each creation is tested and found inadequate. The first humans, made of mud, dissolve. The second, made of wood, are destroyed by a flood of boiling resin. The third, made of corn, survive and become the current humanity. The surviving texts describe these successive destructions not as random expressions of divine displeasure, but as predictable phases in a cycle that the divine powers administer according to a calendrical logic, the Mayan long count calendar, which tracks time in units called baktones, each lasting approximately 394 years, organized into larger cycles called piktones and kalabton, is precisely the kind of large-scale time-reckoning device you would need if you were tracking a cycle measured in thousands of years. The long count does not reset. It accumulates. It can express dates millions of years in the past and millions of years in the future. The end of the 13th Baktun, which fell in December of 2012 by the Gregorian calendar, generated widespread popular speculation precisely because the long count appeared to mark a major transition point in the cycle. The academic response to this speculation was largely correct in its specifics. The Maya did not predict an apocalypse at the end of the 13th Baktun, and the popular media badly misrepresented both the calendar and the Maya themselves. But the corrective response did not address the deeper structural question: why did a pre-telescopic civilization invest the intellectual resources necessary to develop a calendar capable of tracking periods of over 5,125 years? One full great cycle of 13 Baktuns with single-day precision. The conventional answer is agricultural and ritual planning. But agricultural cycles operate on annual time scales. Ritual cycles rarely exceed a few decades. No agricultural or ritual function requires a calendar that counts to 5,000 years with day-level accuracy. The alternative reading, that the calendar was designed to track a long period cycle whose recurrence had survival implications, provides a functional explanation for the calendar's otherwise puzzling precision. The Vedic tradition offers a third independent strand. The oldest of the Vedas, the Rig Veda, composed in Vedic Sanskrit and transmitted orally for centuries before being written down, contains references to cosmic cycles that are elaborated in later texts, including the Puranas and the Mahabharata. The Mahayuga cycle in Hindu cosmology divides time into 4 ages: Satya Yuga, Treta Yuga, Dvapara Yuga, and Kali Yuga, each shorter and more degraded than the one before, with a total duration of 4,320,000 years. The cycle is not linear. It repeats. At the end of the Kali Yuga, the cycle resets, and the Satya Yuga begins again. The Kali Yuga, the current and final age of the cycle, is assigned a duration of 432,000 years. These numbers are large, and the temptation is to treat them as mythological, round figures intended to convey immensity rather than precision. But they are not round. They are specific, and they share a property with the numbers on the Weld-Blundell prism that has been noted but not explained. 432,000 is divisible by 3,600. The quotient is 120, exactly 120 SARs. The Mahayuga total of 4,320,000 years is also divisible by 3,600, producing 1,200 SARs. The Sumerian sexagesimal system and the Vedic time cycles share a numerical substrate. This correspondence was documented by the historian of science Giorgio de Santillana of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and the ethnologist Herta von Dechend of the University of Frankfurt in their 1969 work Hamlet's Mill. Santillana and von Dechend argued that ancient mythological traditions across cultures encode astronomical observations in numerical form, and that the recurrence of specific numbers, 3,600, 432,000, and their multiples and divisors across Mesopotamian, Indian, Icelandic, and Chinese traditions reflects not coincidence but a shared body of astronomical knowledge transmitted through myth. Their work was published by Gambit, a respected academic press, and later reprinted by David R. Godine. It was reviewed in scholarly journals. It has been cited in subsequent academic work on the history of astronomy, and it has not been refuted. The specific numerical correspondence between the Sumerian SAR and the Vedic Yuga durations, the fact that you can express the Kali Yuga as 120 SARs or the Mahayuga as 1,200 SARs remains unexplained by mainstream comparative mythology. Diffusion does not account for it because the Vedic tradition developed in the Indus Valley and the Indian subcontinent independently of Mesopotamian textual culture. Coincidence does not account for it because the numbers are too precise and too consistently related by factors of 60 and 3,600. What accounts for it is an open question. It is still open. The strongest published counter-argument to Sitchin's framework comes from Michael S. Heiser, a scholar of ancient Semitic languages who held a doctorate in Hebrew Bible and Semitic languages from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Heiser spent years critiquing Sitchin's work, and his criticisms deserve the full engagement that Sitchin's numerical claims have not received from mainstream Assyriology. Heiser's primary argument concerns the word Nibiru. He argued that in attested cuneiform contexts, drawing on the Chicago Assyrian Dictionary and the Pennsylvania Sumerian Dictionary, both standard reference works in the field, the word Nibiru means crossing or crossing point. It is a term applied to various celestial bodies and locations, not exclusively to a single undiscovered planet. In several texts, it appears to refer to Jupiter. In others, it functions as a general astronomical term for a point of celestial crossing. Heiser's lexical analysis is well-sourced and methodologically sound. He also argued that Sitchin's reading of the Anunnaki as extraterrestrial visitors is not supported by the broader Sumerian textual corpus, which treats the Anunnaki as divine beings within a polytheistic framework consistent with other ancient Near Eastern religious systems. These criticisms are substantive. They deserve engagement, and any serious treatment of the alternative reading must acknowledge them. Where Heiser's critique is less complete is on the mathematical side. His work focuses on what the words mean, the linguistic content of the cuneiform vocabulary. It does not address why the numbers on the Weld-Blundell prism behave the way they do. The divisibility of every antediluvian reign, length by 3,600, is not a linguistic claim. It is a mathematical observation about a physical artifact sitting in a museum in Oxford. Heiser did not publish a counter-explanation for this regularity. The conventional explanation that the numbers reflect the inherent properties of the sexagesimal number system, since 3,600 is 60 squared, is plausible at first glance, but it is not sufficient on closer examination. Many numbers are expressible in base 60. The sexagesimal system generates an enormous range of values. Not all of them appear in the antediluvian King List. The ones that do appear, and only those, share a single specific property. They are all multiples of the SAR. The question is whether that property is meaningful or coincidental. Heiser's critique, rigorous as it is on linguistic grounds, does not resolve that question. The linguistic argument and the mathematical argument operate on different planes. You can accept Heiser's point that the word Nibiru functions as a general crossing term in some cuneiform contexts, and still observe that the numbers on the Weld-Blundell prism divide cleanly by 3,600. Both things can be true simultaneously. There is also a broader methodological objection that should be stated honestly. Sitchin was not a trained Assyriologist. His translations have been challenged on philological grounds, not only by Heiser, but by other scholars who have pointed to instances where Sitchin's rendering of a Sumerian or Akkadian term differs from the consensus translation in ways that favor his framework. This criticism has weight. Translation of cuneiform is not a casual skill, and the history of the field includes many examples of amateur translators arriving at readings that trained specialists reject. The counter argument that academic consensus is not the same as truth, and that trained specialists sometimes get things wrong, is also valid but does not eliminate the methodological concern. The responsible position is to hold both sides of this tension simultaneously. Sitchin may have mistranslated specific terms, and the mathematical regularity of the King List numbers remains unexplained regardless of whether Sitchin's translations are correct in every particular. The debate between Sitchin's framework and its critics is not a simple binary in which one side is entirely right and the other entirely wrong. It is a layered problem. The linguistic layer has been addressed as imperfectly by both sides, but addressed. The mathematical layer has not. And it is the mathematical layer that bears most directly on the question this script has been asking, whether the texts contain a timing mechanism and whether that mechanism points to a calculable future event. If any substantial part of this reading is correct, if the Sumerian King List encodes orbital data rather than symbolic assertions of antiquity, if the Atrahasis instructions constitute a recurring survival protocol rather than a one-time literary narrative, if the SAR is a physical period rather than a numerical convention, then the implications extend well beyond one artifact and one researcher. It would mean that the oldest written civilization on Earth embedded in its foundational records a timing mechanism for a celestial event that recurs on a multi-millennial scale. It would mean that the scribal tradition of copying and recopying these texts across 1,000 years was not religious piety, but operational continuity, maintaining the protocol across the centuries between passages so that it would be available when the next passage occurs. It would mean that the instructions in the Atrahasis tablets are not addressed only to a man named Atrahasis in one ancient flood. They are addressed to whoever is reading them when the orbital clock reaches the relevant position. It would mean that the conventional boundary between mythology and record, a boundary that organizes the entire field of ancient studies, is drawn in the wrong place for these specific texts, not for all myths, not for every ancient narrative, but for texts like the Atrahasis and the Sumerian King List, which embed specific numbers, specific geographic coordinates, specific construction parameters, and specific timing indicators within a narrative framework. The label mythology may be doing the work that analysis should be doing. The label classifies the material and thereby exempts it from the kind of close quantitative scrutiny that would be applied if the same numbers appeared in a text classified as astronomical or administrative. The Atrahasis numbers and the King List numbers have not received that scrutiny, not because they are unscrutinizable, but because their classification as mythological made the scrutiny seem unnecessary, and it would mean that the cross-cultural parallel, the Hopi worlds, the Vedic yugas, the Mayan long count, the Anunnaki calendar, are not independent mythologies arriving at similar metaphors by coincidence. They are independent records of the same cycle, preserved by different custodians in different parts of the world, using different languages and different calendrical systems, but tracking the same recurring event. The texts are still in their museums. The numbers are still on the prism. The question of what they measure has not been answered in peer review. The Atrahasis tablets are in the British Museum in London. The Weld-Blundell prism is in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. Lambert and Millard's critical edition was published in 1969, and remains the standard scholarly text. Sitchin's reading was published in 1976 and extended in 2007. Heiser's counter-argument is published and accessible. The antediluvian rain lengths on the Weld-Blundell prism are available to any researcher who wants to divide them by 3,600. Everyone divides cleanly. No remainder. No peer-reviewed counter-calculation has been published explaining why. The instructions in the Atrahasis epic are specific, physical, and imperative. They describe what to build, what to seal it with, what to carry, and when to begin. The question of whether those instructions were written for one event or for a cycle, and whether the cycle has a calculable period, is still open. It has been open since Sitchin raised it in 1976. It has been open since Langdon translated the prism in 1923. It has been open since the scribes of the 17th century BCE pressed their styluses into wet clay and copied the instructions one more time, because someone, somewhere, had decided the instructions still mattered. It is still open now.